First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that my opponent is correct that job discrimination is an important issue for LGBT people. However, currently 15 states and DC already protect sexual orientation and gender identity, while only 6 states plus DC currently allow same-sex marriage. It is evident that job discrimination is already more successful despite not being the top priority of the LGBT movement. Thus, the focus should remain on same-sex marriage. Job discrimination is also not as tangible as marriage is, and does not have the cultural weight necessary to lead the movement like marriage does. The LGBT movement can focus its energy on multiple battles at once, including job discrimination. My opponent is also right to point out that single LGBT people will not immediately benefit from the legal rights of same-sex marriage, but they are likely to marry at some point, and they will still benefit from the social change brought with the legalization of same-sex marriage. The rights conferred with marriage are meant to help and protect families, and queer families deserve protection just as much as non-LGBT families. While traditional marriage does grant privileges to heterosexual, non-transgender couples, legally, marriage exists to protect families, and there is no reason that queer families should not receive these same protections, however they define their family. My opponent also criticizes the heteronormative privilege instituted by marriage without proposing an alternative. If my opponent is suggesting that the LGBT movement should not fight for any kind of marriage equality at all, then I must disagree. Marriage brings with it many important rights that all families should have access to. My opponent also says that LGBT people would be compromising their gay identity with the legalization of same-sex marriage. First of all, the LGBT community does not share a single identity or narrative and definitely cannot be generalized under the term gay. Second of all, the marriage equality movement is a fight for legal rights more than it is an attempt to assimilate to heteronormative culture. And I don't see why the LGBT movement should not be trying to achieve these rights. In fact, the fight for marriage equality began in the 80s because queer people were not allowed to see their ill partners in the hospital, and I believe that these kinds of struggles are still what push the movement today. My opponent criticizes same-sex marriage for making the LGBT community more relatable to a homophobic society, but I don't see the problem with this. My opponent states in the beginning that same-sex marriage will only perpetuate discrimination through assimilation, but without incorporating queer identities to the dominant culture, how will discrimination be ended? The goal of the LGBT movement should not be in isolation. That is, LGBT people should not shun heterosexual people or heteronormative society. While heteronormativity does harm the LGBT community, the solution is not to reject anything heteronormative, but rather to reform it to be inclusive of queer identities. This is the best way to promote education and visibility. As my opponent says, same-sex marriage will make queer people palatable to heteronormative society, which I argue is not a bad thing. Queer identities challenge heteronormative society, but without allowing queer and non-queer identities to mingle, society will never be reformed to include LGBT people, and discrimination will never be ended as long as LGBT people remain the other.